Hello everybody! In this video, we're going to be doing our third update to our Atlas FlexTrack layout. So in our second update, we created this N-scale or narrow gauge bridge, and we laid it in place, and we put a little test piece of track over it to see how it looks. So now that that is in place, we can work on our N-scale loop here. So what we did here is kind of a starting point. Is you can see here we've got a little loop of track kind of started here inside those two HO loops there. So we're going to take the same approach we took with the HO scale, and that is to solder a couple of sections of track together on the bench and then lay it here like this one here is laid out, and then put them together and then kind of solder larger sections of track together once it's down on the surface here. So you can see here we started off by soldering a couple sections together. You can see a joint over there, and you can see another one over there in the distance, and then that track. Now that's not where this track is gonna be tacked down. This is just kind of laying here just to kind of gauge how much length 3 sections of N-scale track will give us. So this is Atlas FlexTrack, also similar to the HO scale, and it's just N-scale. So we'll show you some of our soldering techniques only because it's a different gauge. So we'll just show you us soldering a couple pieces together. We'll go over some of the track characteristics like we did with the HO scale, but we won't show us soldering the whole loop. We'll show you some soldering samples, and then we'll show you the completed loop as we move along. And then the last thing we'll do is attach the power feeders to the track, and then we'll take it for a test ride. So for now, why don't we hit the bench and let's solder a couple of lengths of this N-scale Atlas FlexTrack together. Okay, so before we get started soldering, let's talk about some of the track characteristics. So for this N-scale track, this is pretty much, the characteristic-wise, it's pretty much the same as the HO. If we turn this over on its back, you'll see here that one rail slides and can slide within the rail ties there on the ties. The other one is fixed; it does not move. And you can tell the difference between the two sides in that the rail that slides has the little gaps in between each pair of ties. It's not every tie has a gap, but with it, after each pair, you'll see that there's a gap. Pair of ties, gap, pair of ties, gap. So you just want to be aware of that. And when you really want to be aware of it is if you're soldering 2 pieces of track together. So if we take another piece of track here, and let's make sure that we get them on the right side here, you'll notice that we want to always solder with the sliding rail on the same side. You don't want to have the sliding rail on the side of the fixed rail when you're attaching 2 pieces of track together. Otherwise, when you go to flex them like so, they won't want to bend because one is fixed with a piece of sliding rail and the other one is the opposite. And the track, when you go to curve it, will want to twist rather than flex in a curve. So just remember that. The sliding rail is always on the same side. The second thing is the rail joiners. So there's nothing special. It's the same principle. They're just kind of these sliding sleeves, so to speak. But I did want to just kind of point out the difference between the N-scale size and the HO scale size. Obviously, N-scale is smaller in every way, but there's a big difference in the connectors. So when soldering, this is going to be a smaller operation. It's going to be a little bit tighter than it is with the HO scale. And Evan's already soldered 3 pieces of track together, so he's done this 3 times more than I have. This will be my first time trying it, so you'll be sitting here right along with me doing it. And the other thing we'll do too is, like we did with the HO scale, we'll cut back a couple of ties. In order to, when we do the flex, the ties don't crimp on each other, And then what we'll do, once the layout is all down, the same thing we did with the HO scale, and that's kind of put some loose ties underneath the gaps and make them look like they're filled in. So yeah, same technique as we did with the HO, just a different scale or a different gauge. And yeah, so let's get to soldering. All right, so the first thing we're gonna do with each piece of our track here is I'm gonna cut 2 ties off, and then I'm gonna cut 1 tie loose and just push it back to give us a little bit more rail, a little bit more space on the rail in order to do the rail connectors. So here, if we turn this over, you'll see that there's these little plastic tabs that connect the ties to each other. So if I'm gonna take 2 ties off, I just wanna cut the connector between the 2 ties that I'm cutting off. And it's just a matter of just cutting through the plastic here and then sliding the tie off. Super easy. And I'm just gonna cut off the excess here. You can see I left a little bit of the tab. I cut the wrong end. I meant to cut this end to leave a clean tie there, but no problem. Just go ahead and cut them off. Goes without saying, sharp knife is always best. Now this third tie here, what I'm gonna do is, all I'm gonna do is cut off. I'm not going to release the tie off or take the tie off the rails. I'm just gonna cut the little tab. In this case, it's just 1 tab because it's one of those ones with the tab gap here on one side. Or yeah, but I'm just gonna cut that off, and then I'm gonna slide this tie back. This gives us more room, but I can also slide that tie up and after it's all over, and I can, after the soldering is done, and fill in that gap a little bit with a tie that will actually keep the rails at the proper distance apart. So I'm gonna do the same thing here. Release 2 ties. We'll reuse these ties, by the way. When we go to fill the gaps in, we'll take these ties we cut off and we'll reuse those. And then I'm just gonna cut the tabs from between that third tie. And then just push that tie back out of the way. Here's our loose rail here. So we want to make sure that those are nice and even. Okay. And make sure again that they're on the same side. And you can see here, this is our rail that slides on this side, rail that slides on this side at the bottom, on the bottom here. Okay. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to flex up the rails, and then we're going to put the connectors on, and then we're going to solder. All right, so we have our flux paste here. And we've explained this before, and I'm sure that if you're watching this video, you've also seen countless other videos on soldering on the railroad. But the flux, just like with plumber's flux, it really helps the solder flow into the gaps, because the solder flows in the gaps kind of by capillary action, and the flux really helps with that. Now, a lot of the solder we use has a flux core to it also, but we're still going to put on the flux here. And I'm just using a toothpick to do that. You don't need a lot. Then the next thing we're going to do is put on our connectors, if I can get a grip on them. Make sure I show those to the camera. I will say this, the N scale connectors are a little tougher than the HO scale connectors to put on. They're tighter. I'm not even sure you really need to solder this track, to be honest with you, they're so tight, but we're still going to do it. Okay, so there they are on one end. And again, it doesn't hurt just to make sure you still have that sliding rail on the same side on both tracks. And then we'll just force in the connectors here. There's one. And there's the other. Oops, one just came out. These can be a little finicky, so you got to be patient. Okay. And there we go. They're all fastened together. Not soldered, but fastened together. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is take our soldering iron. Now, if you remember from our HO video, soldering, and also, again, from probably the countless other videos you've seen, especially if you're watching this one, you've probably watched others. You want to make sure that you solder on the outside of the rail, not the inside. Remember that the flange of the cars, and with the rolling stock and the locomotives, that flange is on the inside rail, right here. And you don't want anything on the inside of that rail that's going to disrupt that contact. Otherwise, you're going to have derailments and things like that. So we're going to solder on the outside only on both sides of the track. So let's go ahead and do that. Hopefully I'll be able to keep my fingers out of the way here. You can bend the solder, you know, advantageously, as it were, to position it so that you get, you know, comfortable contact without, you know, at an angle that's not awkward for you to hold. Oh, one thing I should mention here before we continue is that you want to make sure your tip is tinned. We covered this last time, but I almost kind of ignored it here. We have this tip tinner. And look, if you look at the tip on that, you can see it's a little rough. So we're going to go ahead and dab that in here. And then we're going to dip our tip into the tip tinner. And what you're going to notice here, I hope, is that point is now nice and shiny. And that's what you want. Scooch that out of the way. We'll melt that right off there. And remember, it doesn't take much. That's probably even a little bit too much. So what we'll do is we'll just spread it out a little bit with the tip of our iron here, and maybe even take some of the material off of it. But that seems like that's going to be a good connection. Now, one thing we'll also do is test, once we're done with this, we'll test, we'll give the old rolling car test and make sure that the car rolls over it smoothly. So what I'm going to do now is take this track and just flip it around so that this side, this rail side, is facing me. So we're just going to turn that around. I don't know if the turning around will make it on camera or not, but we'll go ahead and do that. Now, one thing you also want to do here is to make sure that the rail joints are directly across from each other, you know, because if they're not, then either end of the rest of this track might be off a little bit. And while you can always snip them and make it up later on, it's why put yourself at a disadvantage right off the bat. So just kind of make sure that those are the same length from to each other. That makes sense, hopefully. All right, so we're on the other side now. Let's do this final joint. If your soldering iron ends up sticking, sometimes you heat it up and your solder wire gets stuck to the rail, just heat it up and pull it away. Super easy. All right, that one doesn't look too bad, I don't think. All right, that looks pretty good. And remember, the reason that we're doing this soldering here is not only to hold the joints together, like solidly, so they don't pull apart, but it's also for electrical connectivity, of course. I mean, I think that goes without saying, but just in the interest of thoroughness, we'll just mention that. Now, here's what when we cut that last tie away and moved it down, this is where we can kind of pull that tie back up toward the rest of the rails, and we still have a gap to cover here, but not as much, you know, because we gave ourselves enough room to solder by pushing that tie back, but then if we push it up a little bit, you know, we'll have less, you know, ties to make up later on. You know, we'll just glue those under like so. We'll do it neater, but that's the idea. So, all right, let's solder one more length of track to this, and then we'll put up on the layout and show you kind of what it looks like and how bendy it can be for your curves and so forth, and go from there. Again, make sure the sliding track is on the same side on both tracks. And again, even though we're not soldering on the inside of the rail, you'll notice I'm still putting flux there because there is still, you know, the connector still does kind of wrap around the bottom of the rail even on the inside. So we're not doing it because we're soldering, we're doing it because we want to make sure that we get the, you know, that the flux to suck the solder up, so to speak, into that space. And again, one of the other things too, I didn't mention it, but I hope it goes without saying, is when you're soldering, make sure that the butts ends of both rails are like really as close to each other as they can, touching. You don't want any gaps, you know, left over there that might cause a derailment later on. So. That looks like a nice bead there. It's a good idea to dab your soldering iron tip every now and again, just to make sure you don't have too much solder on here. Like I I feel like we're, like I said, I've said a few times, we're a little heavy-handed with the solder, I think, but I feel like we get good connections. For this one here, we got 3 track lengths together here. So I'm not gonna turn this around to have that joint facing me. This time I am kind of gonna work over on the other side. So I'll be reaching across the rail here to get to that other side. Just wanna be very careful about smoothing this out. Okay. Okay, that looks like a good joint right there. There we go, let's fix that up a little bit. All right, and here is our second joint. We're gonna go over to lay this out on the layout, and we'll give it our car test. Make sure the wheels of the car roll over smoothly, and that'll give us a good indication of how well that joint will function with rolling stock on it. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, guys, so we have 2 lengths of 3 pieces of track, if that makes sense, kind of laid out here. And you can see here's the one that we just did, going across the bridge and making that bend over there. And that's gonna hook up to this one right here. You can see the joint right there, and you can see the rails aren't even yet because we haven't cut them to length. Okay, so there's the joint right there. There's our rail car. We're just gonna push it over, and what we're really doing is the first time we push it over, we'll just push it across, and we're kind of listening to see if there's any rough noises or anything like that that would indicate that that joint may cause problems. So why don't you go ahead and push that across. So that sounds pretty good. That's going over nicely. And then the second thing he's gonna do is kind of put his finger on the roof of the car and move it over the joint and kind of feel if there's any kind of things that might indicate that there's a problem. And he'll just kind of feel that car going over that joint, and it's very smooth. Okay. Looking good. And so we already did it with this joint over here. We already did the car test there, and it ran over that joint pretty smooth too. You can't really even feel the joint, to be honest with you. You can feel a little bit just because there is a joint there, but it's very smooth. We're really happy with the way the rolling stock is passing over those pre-soldered joints. There's no sign of any derailment or any unusual roughness, which is a good sign. So that means we can go on to the next step, which is to temporarily tack down our pre-soldered lengths of track onto the layout where they'll be permanently fixed. And once those pieces of track are temporarily tacked down, we can start soldering all of those sections of track together and close the loop. So this is one of the joints that we have to solder together. And notice here that one piece of rail is longer than the other piece of rail. Whenever you curve this flex track, you're going to get one rail that's going to end up longer than the other. So what we want to make sure happens here is that these rails here butt up cleanly against these rails here. So we're going to have to do a little trimming on the track. And that means we're going to cut away some ties, and then, to expose the rail to be able to put the connector on. And then once we're happy with how those rails are butt ending to their corresponding pair on the other side, then we'll go ahead and solder those. And this is just one joint. We'll have 3 more joints to do. We'll probably do those off camera, since I don't think it's really necessary to show you each and every one we do, especially when we kind of did that with the HO layout. So it's the same principle. So we're going to go ahead and solder this joint together here, and then we'll just move on and complete our loop. Okay, so one thing that you just want to make sure moving forward here is that, again, we've mentioned this a couple times, but that the sliding rails are on the same side here for both pieces of track. And in this case, they are. Our outside rail is the one that's kind of the sliding rail that we described earlier. So the first thing we're going to do is cut away some ties here. So we kind of learned this technique, or figure this technique out on our HO, but you can just cut them from below. Just grab those ties right off of there. And they'll slide right off. So we've got some rail exposed there. You can see we got a little bit of a gap to fill here. So none of this is rocket science here. We're just going to go ahead and look at what looks kind of close, and we'll just we'll do some trimming. We're using these nippers that we bought. These are Xuron, I believe is how you pronounce it. And there is just a recap here from our HO. There's a flat side, and then there's this kind of beveled side. You always want to make sure the flat side is against the piece of track that you're going to keep. So we'll go ahead and put this kind of in position here. And really what I want to do is just get this close so that these two are the same, kind of the same distance. So I'm going to go cut there. That doesn't look too bad. Then I'm going to take this one, do the same thing. Again, just kind of getting them close. We can adjust them, I think, as we move forward. So there's that. And you can see there that, you know, they're going to join up pretty good there, I think. And you should be able to play around with the floating rail if you just need just a little bit of track there to make up some of the... Now I've got a little bit of a gap there, so I think I'm just going to shave off just a tiny bit. And this is not a surgical procedure here, but we want to get as little off there as possible because I really just need a tiny bit. And that looks good right there. See that? All right, so we're going to go ahead and flux those rails. We'll throw some joiners on there, and then we'll go ahead and solder. Okay, I'm just going to throw a piece of thin cardboard onto here just to protect the grass mat. Cardboard is obviously flammable, and this is very hot, but I think we'll be okay. Now, I've usually cut these connectors apart with a razor knife, but these nippers here actually do quite a nice job on the connectors. And then if there's a little tag hanging off at the end of that, you can trim that off too. So I thought when we were doing the HO, the rails on the HO seem to roll over on its side. You're supposed to cut these rail top to bottom, kind of horizontal, not vertical. But on the HO, we got a little bit of roll on the rail whenever we tried to cut with the nippers, and we did a few of them with the Dremel, but these seem to cut nice, these N scale ones. All right, so now that I've got my connectors separated, go ahead and flux up the rails. And like we did with the HO, we just use a little toothpick here to run some flux on those rails. This is probably the most tedious part of the operation, is getting these connectors on. That one went on pretty good. That one went on. So I'm just going to pin that into place. All right, that's not looking too bad. Put a little extra flux on here. Not too much. The flux will just melt. So if you put a lot on there, it's not a huge deal. All right, so I think we're ready to solder. So let's grab our solder and our iron. Move all our tools out of the way. And again, we're soldering on the outside of the rail. Okay, there's one side. And I think that might do it. Okay, with that joint done, we'll do our car test here. And this sounds pretty good going over there. I think that joint will be good. So now we're just gonna work our way around and solder the other joints and complete our loop. All right guys, so as you can see here, we finished soldering all the joints and our end scale or narrow gauge loop is complete. Now this loop isn't powered up at all, it's just all connected in one continuous loop. Where am I there? Yep, there we go. So now the next thing we want to do is, before we commit to fastening the track to the layout, we want to test it and just make sure all our joints are good and we've got no derailments and things like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these red pins out. We're going to put in some temporary nailings, which hopefully will be permanent nailings, but we're just not going to put in all the nails. We'll just put in periodically along the layout, just enough to hold the track down. And then we'll put some leads on the track and we'll put a locomotive on it and see how she runs. What we're going to do here is test the loop with Rusty here, our end scale locomotive. And rather than, already having the leads or the feeder wires attached to the track, we just have a temporary setup here with these little alligator clips here running to our transformer. And we're just gonna run him around the track once just to make sure that, like I said, we have good continuity and he runs smooth and there's no potential for derailments. All right, so let's give him a test. All right, except for crossing the feeder wires there, he made it all the way around the track, so I'd consider that a pretty successful test. Okay guys, so the first thing you want to do here is, choose your wire, first of all. So we're going to use this 22 gauge wire here. This is just kind of general purpose wire. It's got a red strand and a black strand. And then what we want to do is make sure that we're using a bit that is about the diameter of the wire so that you can fit it up through the bottom of the, feed it up from the table. So we're going to take the drill, we're going to drill a hole on between some ties here on either side, on the outside again of the rail, and then we'll go ahead and fasten that in there. All right guys, so there is our feeder wires soldered to the end scale track, the outside of the end scale track. So not too bad. It seems like no matter what size wire, that's 22 gauge, and I think that's the recommended wire for N scale. So as compared here to this like 18 gauge bell wire that we used on the HO scale track. But yeah, there it is. It passed the car test. The car rolled over it nice. So we have now hooked our wires up from the track to the back of our power supply that we use for our N scale loops. And we've got Rusty back on the track, and let's do another test. This is the permanent wiring now. And we'll just watch him do one complete loop here, just to make sure everything looks good. Over the new bridge. And all the way back. All right, everybody, in order to finish up our N scale or narrow gauge loop here, we just had to do two final little details here. The first one was after we did our test run to make sure that the train made it all the way around the loop and the connectivity was good and there were no derailments. We went ahead and we permanently fastened the track to the layout. So you can see there all of the nails in the pre-drilled holes in the ties are all in. So that track is being held down pretty securely. And here we go with Prince coming by here, one of our narrow gauge locomotives. The other little detail we did was we filled in the gaps here with ties to make it, look like one continuous run of track rather than the big gaps we had from the from the joints and the soldering and things like that. So those ties that are filling in there, I think there's probably like maybe 3 or 4 ties per joint that we had to fill in, and those are we just placed those underneath. They're being held in by tension by the track being fastened with nails to the layout, but they're also white glued in with some Elmer's glue, and that glue dries clear, so that's really nice. So that looks pretty good. But yeah, those are the final details for this update before we go on to the next thing. Okay, so that's going to do it for update number 3. We've laid down our N scale or narrow gauge loop, and we're ready to move on to the next stage. So in update number 4, we're going to be ballasting all 3 loops of track. So we're going to be ballasting the 2 loops of HO, and we're going to be ballasting the loop of N scale or narrow gauge track. So that should be fun, and we're looking forward to getting onto that part of the project. So we'll see you in the next video.